Welcome to your channel, The Lost History. The importance of studying history lies in its value to university professors, heads of institutions, rulers, and military leaders, as it helps them assess the present and foresee the future. Otherwise, history would be nothing more than fascinating bedtime stories to entertain children before they sleep. What we have witnessed in our lands of barbaric and savage aggression without justification is nothing but a repetition of countless historical events that occurred long ago. Perhaps a story that took place thousands of years ago might be powerfully relevant at this very moment. This is a story recorded by the Greek historian Thucydides, who lived during that era and wrote it in his book nearly 2,400 years ago. Due to its importance, this book is still taught today and is considered one of the most significant works of political and military history. In 414 BC, a fierce war raged between the two Greek giants, Sparta and Athens, lasting for 10 years, historically known as the Peloponnesian War. Meanwhile, Melos was a very small island, neutral and independent. Although the people of Melos were of Spartan origin and shared blood and lineage with them, they pledged allegiance to Athens, forming treaties and agreements as a way to avoid Athens' wrath and to distance themselves from the horrors of war and bloodshed. Yet, this was not enough to protect them. One morning, the people of Melos were shocked to find the mighty Athenian fleet surrounding their island. The Athenian commanders sent envoys to negotiate with them. The leaders of Melos went forth to negotiate, supported by justice, treaties, and international law, while the leaders of Athens came backed by brute force. The Athenians openly demanded that Melos forget all treaties and agreements and fully surrender, submitting completely and humiliatingly to Athens, or else face total annihilation. The Melians were astonished and tried to dissuade them through diplomacy, appealing to their sense of honor and reaffirming their commitment to treaties and agreements. But the Athenians replied coldly, "You already serve us willingly. There is nothing new you can offer." The Melians responded, "We hold the right, based on laws and treaties. If you betray us, your allies will abandon you in favor of Sparta, and you will lose your credibility." The Athenians retorted, "We have the strongest fleet in Greece, and power alone grants us control over our allies." At that moment, the Melians decided they would fight in defense of their freedom, believing that Sparta and its allies would surely come to their aid and not leave them to face Athens alone. But because they had separated themselves from their Spartan roots and allies, they ended up fighting this war entirely on their own. The result: the Athenians stormed the island, slaughtering every man, leaving not a single one alive. The women and children were enslaved, and their homes and lands were taken over by settlers from Athens. The women and children of Melos became lifelong slaves, and the Melians became a forgotten people. Indeed, the Melians were correct in their prophecy. Athens was eventually defeated near the end of the war when its allies abandoned it. However, there were no Melians left to witness those events. This story is still taught today to every political or military leader because it perfectly illustrates what is known as international law in politics. It shows, without leaving any room for doubt, that treaties, agreements, and even international laws do not protect a weak and small nation when faced with a powerful one. For the strong do as they please, while the weak suffer what they must. The eminent legal scholar, Dr. Abdelrazak Ahmed Al-Senhouri, professor of civil law at Cairo University, dean of the Faculty of Law, and known as the father of civil law, summarized international law in a few simple words. International law can only truly exist between two parties that are equal in strength or weakness. But when one side is strong and the other weak, the law becomes nothing more than a cover for the will of the strong. who imposed their terms and disguised them in the cloak of legality. Over 1,000 years after the events of that story, in the very heart of the desert of the Arabian Peninsula, an elderly leader stood besieged with only a small band of his men, trapped in a small village surrounded by enemies and rebels on all sides. And yet, within just 2 years, he managed to literally change the face of the earth. He divided his men into 11 armies and sent them out simultaneously in every direction to subdue the rebels. In less than a year, he reunified the Arabian Peninsula under a single banner and a single ruler. And in the following year, he did not rest. Instead, he dispatched his armies to confront the two greatest and most powerful empires on earth at the time, the Romans and the Persians, simultaneously. This is something almost impossible for us to imagine by any standard. In the book, The Great Arab Conquests, by the British general johnglubb, known in Egypt, Jordan, and Iraq as Glubb Pasha, he was commissioned by Britain to study and analyze the history of the Islamic conquest from the very beginning, approaching it with precise academic, military, and strategic methodology. Glubb noted that al-Siddiq, Abubakar, in these decisions violated every fundamental military and strategic principle known at the time. Historians and Glubb himself considered Abu Bakr's actions to be extraordinarily bold, amounting to a major military and political gamble. Or rather, as I understood from reading his book, he was circling around a word he did not state explicitly: a colossal strategic military folly. From Glubb Pasha's strictly military perspective, shaped by his own battlefield experience, sending an army of 18,000 volunteer, non-regular soldiers to confront the seasoned, professional, and well-equipped Persian imperial forces, fighting them on their own territory, under their veteran military commanders and with their immense resources, was nothing short of madness by every measure. But Abu Bakr did not stop there. At the very same time, he sent 4 similar armies to Greater Syria to confront the mighty Roman Empire. Within just a few years, the Islamic Empire stretched from the borders of China in the east to southern France in the west, forming the largest, most powerful, and fastest-growing empire in history. In reality, Glubb Pasha's astonishment and conclusions about this man were justified if we only judge by academic and scientific standards of leadership and warfare. For wars are not fought by soldiers alone, but rather, as Ibn Khaldun said in his timeless words, states are built upon armies. Armies are built with wealth, and wealth comes from development and resources. Yet knowledge always has its blind spots, with many aspects that scholars cannot fully explain, and thus, history often surprises us with strange events that overturn expectations. In this book, which I strongly recommend reading, Glubb clarifies that the Muslim armies were never, in any battle, equal to their enemies. The balance of numbers and equipment was always heavily in favor of the Romans or Persians. Even the level of leadership, training of soldiers, logistics, and familiarity with the terrain were all advantages held by the opposing side. And yet, the Muslim armies were defeated in only a handful of battles, so few that they could be counted on the fingers of one hand. What is truly astonishing is that what some considered madness was consistently the very reason for victory. Take, for example, the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD, 15 AH. Emperor Heraclius gathered a massive army from all corners of the empire, along with the most elite mercenaries from across Europe, spending tons of gold over an entire year to assemble the most powerful Roman army in the history of the empire. His aim was to meet the Muslims in one final decisive battle, to drive them permanently out of Greater Syria. The Byzantines stood with a massive army, at the very least, numbering more than 220,000 soldiers, equipped with the most advanced weapons, led by the most skilled commanders and trained to the highest standards. In contrast, the Muslims were able to assemble an army that did not exceed 30,000 men, even by the most generous estimate. And if you think that it is madness for such a small, outnumbered army to stand against such a colossal, well-equipped force, then you might be mistaken. For what was about to happen was far beyond madness. For 3 consecutive days, the Byzantines overpowered the Muslims, pressing down upon them like collapsing mountains, and victory seemed utterly out of reach for the Muslims. On the 4th day, the Byzantines broke through the Muslim lines at several points, splitting parts of the army away from the center, and defeat loomed on the horizon like a dark specter. But on the 5th day, what happened can only be described, by modern standards, as madness itself. At dawn, Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl stepped forward to the front ranks, tied a red band around his head, and called out to the army, "Who among you will pledge to me to fight until death?" 400 of the bravest horsemen came forth and replied, "We are with you until we meet Allah." This was the unit that historians later called the Battalion of Death. In my view, this madness was the very key that opened the gates of victory. At daybreak, the Battalion of Death charged like an arrow straight into the heavily fortified heart of the Byzantine army, shattering through it amid the stunned disbelief of the Romans. The Byzantines quickly surrounded them from every direction. Thousands of soldiers, shields and spears, bodies and blood flying amidst clouds of dust kicked up by the horses. The Romans deployed their best elite units in a desperate attempt to push them back toward the Muslim lines, but they could not, for these warriors sought death, not life. The front lines of the Byzantine army began to falter, falling into disorder as they tried to encircle them, and the entire strategy to trap the Muslims collapsed. Every single one of the 400 horsemen of the Battalion of Death was martyred, but only after they had slain thousands of Roman soldiers and commanders. Yes, they lost their lives, but the Romans lost their courage. Fear gripped their hearts, and despair struck their veteran commanders. The siege around the Muslim army was broken, allowing them to regroup and reorganize their lines. The hearts of the Muslims blazed with passion and hope, and they fought with renewed strength, as if it were the very first day of battle. On the 6th day, the mighty Byzantine army collapsed completely, its troops scattering in every direction, and the once besieged, outnumbered Muslim army, which had been awaiting annihilation, emerged victorious. At this precise moment, Glubb Pasha writes in his book, "The Byzantine army, which Heraclius had spent a year of immense exertion to collect, had entirely ceased to exist. There was no withdrawal, no rearguard action, no nucleus of survivors. There was nothing left." I say the balance of power is usually measured by the size of economy, the advancement of sciences, and the sheer numbers of armies. But international politics, wars, and the will of people cannot be confined only to material measures of strength. Yes, these are vitally important and fundamental factors in determining outcomes. But history repeatedly shows us that what unfolds in reality often transcends these calculations. How many allies throughout history have been betrayed by their own partners? For an ally without strength is nothing more than prey, devoured by his partner whenever he wishes. And how many small, impoverished groups have defeated vast empires and massive armies? Indeed, I say this, Egypt, vast in its land, teeming with people, with Roman armies fortified in its cities and strongholds, was conquered by only 4,000 men, who were later reinforced by another 4,000. Al-Andalus, with its mountainous, rugged terrain, its fortresses, and a standing army of 100,000 professional soldiers, was conquered by just 12,000 volunteers. And ironically, the Muslim armies in Al-Andalus were never defeated, except in the Battle of Poitiers, and that only happened when their numbers grew close to those of their enemies. A state that hosts the largest Western military bases in the Gulf, armed with the best defenses the West can offer, when such a catastrophe strikes on its own soil, it is not merely a blow to its people or rulers, but rather a stinging slap to the very face of the West itself. And I ask, what rational person can still trust and rely upon Western protection, weapons, and influence after this? How closely the West today resembles ancient Athens, losing its credibility among its allies in the region, and indeed, throughout the entire world. And how closely we resemble the people of the island of Melos, whose men were slaughtered, and women and children enslaved. I say, the time has come for us to realize that those who now fight like lions, with their very lives and their wealth, fearing neither death nor the blame of any critic in the cause of Allah, are fighting in our defense while we sit idle. They are the first line of defense, and we the second line. If they are defeated, may Allah forbid, then we have been defeated as well, and the fate of the people of Melos will not be far from our own fate.